Mr. Brown, it was 20 years ago, and that was not when Sergeant Pepper taught the band to play, but it is when the FAA said, hey, here's Sport Pilot, and this is what a light sport aircraft is. And I got to admit, for me, everything changed, although for a long time, that was a much misunderstood certificate and category of aircraft.
I would say that even today, there's some misunderstandings about it. So maybe we could talk about that, huh?
Well, the one that sticks out with me is so many people for so long said Sport Pilot is a dumbed down version of Private Pilot, which isn't at all true.
That's right.
There are fewer tasks, but the tasks there are have the exact same completion standards as Private Pilot.
Yeah, there's a little difference in the cross country, and there's no night flying requirement, so we don't have to worry about that. And there's no hood time required, so we don't have to worry about that. But pretty much everything else, it's plus or minus 100 feet, plus or minus 10 knots, plus or minus 10 degrees. I mean, it's pretty much a private pilot check ride.
And here's what I love about it now that I, unlike you, but I am 20 years older. You have frozen in time, and I respect that.
I wish.
Since I'm 20 years older, you know, it depends on your perspective. Some people thought Sport Pilot was supposed to be an inexpensive way to get into general aviation. But for old dudes like me, it's an inexpensive and easier way to stay in general aviation because
Right.
as long as I'm flying under the Sport Pilot privileges of my certificate, and I'm a commercial pilot, and I'm flying a light sport aircraft, which I've owned a couple of them, Cubs, things like that, I can pretty much do whatever I want with really the limitations aren't things that I really desperately wanted to do anyhow, like go above 10,000 feet.
Yeah, with the proper training, you can fly in class Bravo, Charlie, or Delta airspace. You have to have endorsements for that, but with the proper training, you can do that. You can't fly above 10,000 feet, or I think it's 2,500 feet AGL if the terrain is at 10,000 feet.
2,000 AGL,
2,000
but
feet,
you're
thank you.
so close. I like that.
So close,
And
yet so far away.
I'm writing this down because this is the first time I think that I knew something you didn't know. Okay. I'm just going to put a little gold star on my calendar.
Well,
It was
uh,
bound to happen someday.
I'm speechless. But there was this one time that I thought I was wrong, and it turns out I wasn't. So that was a
Heavy
mistake.
is the head that wears the crown.
Yeah, I'm telling you what. But you can, as you can with pretty much any airplane, you can fly coast to coast without really having to talk to anybody
Hmm.
on a light sport airplane, and there's nobody that says that you can't do that as long as it qualifies under current light sport rules. And of course, there's high hopes that when the Mosaic rule goes into effect, and that stands for, and I wrote this down because I can never remember it, Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certification Rulemaking. That's what
Trips
Mosaic,
right off the tongue. Just
easy. Mosaic is much easier to say. But with Mosaic, uh, uh, there will the weight of the airplane will go up. Their limiting their limiting factor is the stall speed, and right now there's still some haggling back and forth as what the final stall speed will be, but it'll be fairly significantly higher than what it is currently. And four places instead of two, although you can only carry one passenger. You can't use all four seats, but there's some pretty cool things about the Mosaic rule that that I think will benefit a lot of people that want to fly, excuse me, under the sport pilot rule, but want to fly a little faster than what the current sport pilot rule allows them to fly.
I agree with you. And even as it exists now, I find the sport pilot rule to be really advantageous to us. I no longer need to go get a medical or do basic med. As long as I've never had a medical declined, I'm good to go. As long as I fly a light sport aircraft with no more than one passenger, I'm good to go. And really, most of my flying is either solo or with one other person. So
Right.
there's an awful lot I can do. And the spectrum of light sport aircraft is enormous. I mean, there's brand new production stuff. I was just talking to a guy on the phone last night who imports Evectors, I believe, from the Czech Republic.
That's a
But
great
there's the
airplane.
Technems from Italy.
Another great
There's
airplane.
brands and vans, and everybody makes something that's kind of light
Right.
sportish. And of course, there's the legacy things like the Cubs and the Champs and most air coupes. There's a lot out there that aren't burning a whole lot of fuel and still allow you to have a lot of fun.
Yeah, the Luscombe, I think the Luscombes fit into that category. Um, yeah, as you said, there's a bunch of them, and they don't cost an arm and a leg to acquire, and they don't cost an arm and a leg to maintain. You can buy them or you can build them. Vans has one that you can build. Several other manufacturers do as well, or you can buy them factory built. ELSAs or SLSAs. There's a little bit different parameters as to what you can do to the airplane depending on whether you've built it or whether you've bought it as a factory built. But light sport was intended. I really do believe that the intent of light sport was to bring the cost of entry down. It didn't quite work out that way. I remember when we had a flight school and ours specialized in LSA training, and we were busy. If we wanted to buy a brand new LSA at the time, fully tricked out, it was $160,000, $170,000. That's not a cheap airplane.
No, it's not. Although on the flip side, if we went for a legacy like an Aranca Champ, you can still find those for $30,000.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
very inexpensive to maintain. Frankly, Pat, there's just not many systems. There's a lot of the old legacy ones, like the Aranca Chiefs, Champs, Cubs. There's no electrical system. There's no hydraulic system other than the brakes. They're very simple. So even when you come up on annual, an owner assisted annual is just go in and remove the inspection covers. The whole fuselage is open. Sometimes you can get away with a good annual that actually meets the requirements and gives you confidence for a few $100
yeah,
because there's just not that much to it.
yeah, yeah. And you alluded to this earlier, but you can make a unilateral decision yourself that you're going to fly under light sport rules. One of the misconceptions is, what do I have to do if I want to fly under light sport? You just basically have to say to yourself, "Self, I'm going to fly under light sport," and then go do it. Go, find a light sport airplane, find someone that's qualified to check you out in it. And by the way, any CFI, any airplane CFI can teach in light sport or teach the light sport certificate. Any CFI can do that. Now there are special CFIs that they're called CFIS for CFI Sport, and all they can do is CFI is light sport stuff. But if anyone holds just a standard CFI, you can teach. Now, sometimes weight is a limiting factor.
Mhm.
There are certain Americans that are rather portly,
I'm
and
sitting right here. I can hear you.
I'm not calling out any names. I'm just simply saying that there are certain people that are somewhat portly, and that could be a limiting factor, especially if the student is likewise somewhat portly. So you really want to do some research. There are LSAs out there that have notoriously little useful load with any kind of gas in it at all, and then there are some that have quite generous useful loads where carrying a couple of 220 pounders or maybe more isn't really problematic. Maybe not with full fuel, but when you're only burning 4 gallons an hour, maybe five if you're pushing it, especially with these Rotaxes, those can be very viable airplanes with decent range and maximum speed of 120 knots. That's 130 miles an hour.
I used to have that exact issue because I am a bigger boy.
Hmm.
When I was at the seaplane base flying Cubs on floats or the Icon A5, both
Right,
of which I really love.
right.
With the Icon, for instance, I would only go with 8 gallons of fuel because
Yeah,
that would be our weight limit. But that gives me almost 2 hours of flight time in that thing, and I'm
right,
only going out for 30, 45 minutes.
right.
It's not a problem. So it changes the way you fly. But we had talked in a previous video about cross countries and making long distance flights. most private pilots don't really go beyond 100 miles, 150 miles. So the sport pilot, which, as you said, you can go from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the southern border to the northern border, you can do the whole thing. But for most of what people do in general aviation, going out for the $100 hamburger, going off to visit grandma's house or whatever, the light sport aircraft does fine. And as you say, if I'm a private pilot, a commercial pilot, an airline transport pilot, all I have to do is say, oh, now I'm operating under sport pilot privileges and limitations in a light sport aircraft. There's no
Yeah.
more to it than that.
Yeah. And just again to kind of reiterate, your medical cannot have been revoked, denied, or the application withdrawn after it's been activated. If that's the case, then you're going to have to fix the problem and then get your third class medical. Um, um, and then you can just basically say, okay, I'm flying from light sport from this point forward. But if you've had a revocation, a withdrawal, or a denial, you're going to have to fix whatever that problem is. That's about the only caveat to being able to fly light sport,
Yeah.
just and a willingness to do it.
Just carry your driver's license to self-certify, carry your pilot's certificate. And of course, if you wake up with a fever of 103 and you're vomiting, ground yourself. Today's not a good day to go, but
Yeah.
you're right. And it might not be, gee, I'm really worried that I'm going to lose my medical at my next appointment. It might just be, you know what? I don't want to go through the hassle anymore. I don't want to make the appointment. I don't want to go. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I'm just going to fly light sport. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to probably stay relatively local. Maybe eventually I'll fly out to Texas to see you, Pat. But what's wrong with doing that? And it really does. It's a cheaper aircraft to operate. It's a cheaper aircraft to own. It offers all the fun. And I've done both. There's not a big difference between being in the 182 at 8,000 feet and being in the Cub at 1,000 feet and flying along and just having a nice day. It's pretty
One of
much
the
the same.
objections, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. One of the objections early on was that you're going to have a bunch of old people flying airplanes and they're going to be crashing and burning and plummeting to the ground because their medical history is such that they should never be flying an airplane, much less driving a car. That did not happen, and it's still not happening. And I'm absolutely convinced that helped to pave the way for basic med, which has been a thing now for what 5, 6 years now.
Yeah.
And the FAA was mandated to do a study at the end of the fifth year to see how safety was impacted. And essentially, the report said there has been no impact on safety, no negative impact on safety whatsoever. So there's no indication that responsible pilots flying under light sport rules or basic med for that matter are are a hazard to the rest of the aviation public. There's just nothing to indicate that.
You got to admit, though, there was a moment there where it was kind of cool that old dudes were considered hazardous and we were dangerous guys. But, we're talking about this for folks in our age bracket or people who are just, private pilots or whatever, that I don't want to do medical anymore. I'm not going to fly the big plane. I'll fly the little
Yeah.
one. But there's another part of this that I don't think people really think about. One of the intents was this would be a really inexpensive way to get involved in aviation, and you mentioned that. But part of it is because there's only 20 hours of training required. And
Right.
that's not really dumbing down the license because the completion standards are the same, but there are things like the night flying you don't do as a sport pilot. So you really could, if your kid or your grandkid or you thought, gee, maybe it is time to get into aviation. Maybe I want to try this, but man, a private pilot certificate could be $12,000, $15,000. Well, sport pilot's half of that. If you love it and you're good at it and you want to complete, all you got to do is a little bit of extra training, add on your private, and then a little bit more, add your instrument. I mean, it really is a stepping stone process
Yeah.
to go as high in the rankings as you want, or just stay a sport pilot.
Yeah, it's 15 hours of dual and 5 hours of solo is what that requirement is. But once again, we have to caution those folks that may be listening to this and are considering going that route. Speaking of private pilot, the national average is, depending on who you talk to and what figures you're looking at, somewhere between 60 and 70 hours for a private pilot certificate. The requirement is 40.
Hmm.
And it's a similar thing for light sport. The requirement is 20, but when we had our light sport school, um, the only people we were able to get through it were in 20 hours were two or three kids that we had coming to us who grew up with parents that owned and flew airplanes,
Hmm.
and so they had time in the right seat, playing pilot with mom or dad in the left seat. More realistically, it was around 35, but still, that's 35 hours instead of 60 to 70. So the cost, if you figure that a private pilot certificate, depending on where you are, could be, um, say, 15 to 18K. It could be
Hmm.
more in some places, less in others. Sport pilot is probably about half of that.
The first person I met who earned a sport pilot certificate did it in 21 hours. And
Yeah,
he was a ship's captain professionally. That's what he did. So I still maintain the cost of your flight training really does come down to how well you study and practice. And it doesn't
yeah,
matter which rating or certificate you're going for. If you're flying once a week and you study for 10 minutes before your lesson and no other time, it's
yeah,
going to take you longer. But
yeah.
the point of this episode is sport pilot is a valid option for an awful lot of us, including myself, and maybe even you, Pat Brown, at some point. It's worth looking at. Don't think of it as a dumbed down thing. Don't think of it as shameful or that you're limited to this. It's one of the options the FAA gives us. If it fits the mission, go for it.
I totally agree.
I love it when we agree. And I especially love this because I was right and you were wrong. I'll never bring it up again, except maybe every day we see each other, but I was right.
I'll never live that down. I will never live it down. But okay, I can
Yeah, but
take it.
you won the trivia contest at Sun and Fun, and I'm still humiliated over that. Hey, Pat, thanks a lot. I do appreciate you covering this topic because as you say, I think this is a very misunderstood certificate
Yeah.
that offers a lot of flexibility. So, y'all, click the like button because Pat put a lot of work into this, and he really does know his stuff. Leave a comment down below because we particularly like your comments. And of course, subscribe to the channel because subscribership keeps growing. And that's what makes us feel validated as human beings and YouTube content creators. We'll see you next time.
Adios.